Yeah, thank you, John. My apologies for not getting this finished yesterday and simply ran out of time. Timing's not my strongest point. My wife of 20 years will tell you that. Always usually fairly punctual, but it comes to this sort of thing, hopeless. So the presentation yesterday was in two parts. The first was to do with nurseries and myrtle rust. The second part was just to give a bit of an oversight as to what's going on in Australia with selection, breeding and related matters. It follows on a little bit with the talk that Simon Williams gave this morning, which I thought was an excellent overview of the work he does and the work going on at the University of the Sunshine Coast. There was Australians are good at not doing much. I mean, eucalypts are uniquely Australian. They were planted all over the world, going back to the 1800s. Nowadays, it's the biggest forestry species internationally by a long way, and it's planted in every continent except Antarctica, and it's a dominant forestry genus. The interesting thing about that, which says a lot about Australians, is that when I started in horticulture back in the 1970s, I was told by authorities, by foresters, Ted, you can't grow eucalypts in Australia. You can only grow Pinus radiata. What are you talking about? But while this was going on, the CSIRO, which is Australia's leading science institute, was telling the Brazilians and people in the African continent how to grow eucalypts. I was sending scientists around doing all this work and getting them all set up nicely. There's a very similar scenario with leptospermum. There's a massive genetic resource in Australia. That's where they come from, all 83 species originally. Most of them are still there. It's something that very little work has been done on. It's a eucalypt scenario again. And I found that when the ABC landline program went to air in 2015, which was really a story about what the manuka industry had been doing in New Zealand, and asking the question, why aren't we doing something, was the underlying message coming out of that program. Well, it set the cat amongst the pigeons, and it really was a wake-up call. Why aren't we doing something? We've got all this stuff growing everywhere. Since then, the momentum's been building. There was work being done in Australia prior to 2015. I see Peter Brooks has just walked in, who's one of the icons of the Australian science honey industry. So things have really spiked up since then, and Simon Williams, as you heard this morning, if you heard him, gave an excellent presentation on where we are with that at the moment. I tend to be, he focuses mainly on finding out what the 83 species are capable of in terms of their usefulness and DHA and other aspects. I'm more interested in adaptability, how these things can be brought into an economics system, into a plantation system. So plantations are my background, not only in this, but also in eucalypts and other crops. So I have basically been working on this seriously since 2015. I've had a couple of trips to New Zealand prior to that and was blown away by the industry, how it had been developed in New Zealand. I thought it was fantastic, and went back and I have a website with an online store on it, and that went absolutely ballistic. Everybody had to have leptospermum sciparium in their garden or in their paddocks or somewhere. So it's been building solidly since then. In the meantime, we're doing a lot of travelling, a lot of testing, a lot of sampling, and we're sort of heading down what could ultimately be a very large explosion, in my view. We've heard already that the 83 species and what they're capable of, and there's a map of Australia which shows where leptospermum occur around the continent. I tend to focus on two species at the moment, A, because there's been a lot of work done on them, and B, because they're well known, and C, and most importantly, they have adaptability because of their natural range. You can see where sciparium is Tasmania, Victoria, a little bit into New South Wales, but not much, negligible. Polygalifolium occurs from north of the border right up to Cape York Peninsula. We'll start with Scoparium, which we first started sampling in the Grampians region in 2016, not very long ago. And that's where the species occurs naturally. Now forget all the little individual dots, because they are plants that have been found in gardens or in arboreta and in parklands and so on. It's the heavy concentrations are where the main plants occur. And if the photograph shows Simon sitting there and myself, the fat one, and a team from the University of Adelaide out in the Grampians in January. You know, very hot temperatures, terrible, dry as a bone. And there we are, we had a week up there sampling and so on. There we go, the Grampians. That's a photo of the Grampians and just an individual plant of Scoparium growing on the side of the road. I thought it would be a nice cover for a calendar, so I took a photo of it. This is down on the coast, some distance away, a separate occurrence of the species and in a completely different environment. You can see there's one flowering there. That's probably about 4 metres tall, that plant. It's growing in infertile coastal sand. It's very wet in winter, dry as a bone in summer, and about 500 metres from the coast, which is one of the windiest places on the planet. The plant in front of it, the plant in the foreground, which is in bud that you can't see, it demonstrates the fact that these plants have a long flowering period, up around about 2 months, but each individual plant only flowers for a month or so. So different flowering periods within that larger envelope. The process is pretty standard. Go out and look for plants that have the desirable traits. They might be the size of the flower, the general habit of the plant, its health, its general vigour, and then geotag that and put an aluminium tag on it. Take some nectar, go back and get it sampled, and away we go. It shows how close they are on the coast. On the side of the road, sampling into a refrigerator and then snap frozen and sent to the lab in Queensland. There we go. So the results are quite interesting. This was over 2 summers, and one summer was the wettest year experienced for a long time. The next one was the dry, I think the wrong way, but anyway, one was the driest and one was the wettest. The first one was the driest. Results are quite interesting. Lots of samples taken, and the Grampians one, top 20%, came out at 3,000 to 5,000 parts per million, and the coastal provenance, 6,000 to 7,000. But the interesting bit there is the completely different flowering periods, and you can see that the potential for exploiting that in the sense that by mixing them we can have a very long flowering period, possibly up to 4 months of the year. And that did not change from the year 1 to year 2, suggesting that the rainfall, climate and temperature hasn't got a lot to do when the flowering starts and finishes. It's all embedded in the genes. The little red circle is actually where I live, and I've got these plants out there planted around the place, and I want to see whether or not the flowering period is maintained when they're taken away from their natural environment. We get that spread. Pretty basic stuff. We collected the best we selected the best plants, went back, took cuttings, cloned them and put them into a seed orchard with a view to generating genetic gain, but also generating a seed source for plant production for prospective projects. There we go. We've got, this is an in-ground one. We've got more seed orchards planned for this year, which will be done under a controlled environment system where we can guarantee purity with no contamination from outside. We moved to Queensland now, and the bloke standing there in the white hat's sitting over here at the moment. That's a lovely place. That's out in a coastal heathland, a swamp, almost impossible to walk through, with grass growing up to your elbows and taipans rustling around and snakes and ticks and God knows what else, mosquitoes. Not a very pleasant place. But it's a point of interest that I'll come back to in a moment, a place of interest, sorry. And in that time I've travelled the Polygallifolium Natural Distribution Trail, which is taken up west of Atherton Tableland in Queensland, where we found them growing in a creek bed. It's seasonally wet, otherwise very dry. And out, if I move the slide on, out west of Stanthorpe along the New South Wales border, Polygallifolium again. It's given a different subspecies name, but it's basically the same plant. And interestingly enough, they were growing in a hollow next to the road, so they get watered periodically when there's a thunderstorm or something. But when they were tested in a dry period, when they were flowering, they had no nectar, which suggests that they close down if there's a drought. Interesting. This one here is Polygallifolium cross Scoparium, growing near the Victorian border. It's about as far south as it goes. Nice looking plant, lots of vigour, huge big capsules on it. Collected some, took them home, and the capsules would not open. They would not open, couldn't extract any seed out of them at all. That's probably one of the traits of a hybrid in this instance. So a lot more work to do on that side of things. So we haven't been able to get back there to test the nectar on that yet, but that's planned for the spring. This is in a forest of YTI up in Noosa area. Keep going. This is an area that we visited many times, and with a view to determining what is the difference between the best in a community of Leptospermum, what is the range of values between the worst and the best. We've done this with Scoparium, and the answer to that is somewhere between 4 and 7 times the difference between the very poorest, lowest DHA individuals in that wild community and the highest. And you can see there the plants are marked as GPS points, and the average 12,000 parts per million. So it's very early days, and it's just a starting point really as far as I'm concerned. It will get better, but it's not a bad outcome on the first attempt. Same story, collect seed, take cuttings, clone them, put them into a seed orchard with a view to creating a greater genetic gain. That's what it looks like. There's already been talk earlier from Simon and others that we've got to have nectar flow, not just high DHA, and you can see there the outcome. So in selecting plants to breed from, it's obvious you need to find a compromise between DHA and nectar flow in this instance. And you can see that not necessarily would you take the highest one, the fifth one from the left, incorporating into a breeding program. Take one where there's a good balance between the blue and the orange. So, just referring back to myrtle rust again, and talking about the placement of plantations in Australia, I'm becoming much more interested in finding solutions to this than I was a year or two ago when we thought the whole thing had blown over, which it obviously hasn't. So we're saying there what myrtle rust needs is soft new growth tissue, we know that. Free water on plant surfaces for 6 hours or more, night temperatures, low light conditions, life cycle, blah, 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 blah. And there are not that many places along the eastern seaboard of Australia where those conditions apply reliably. Is what it doesn't need is low humidity, very cold temperatures, particularly at night, very hot temperatures, lots of UV radiation, combined with low humidity and dry foliage, high light conditions with short hours of darkness, and all above conditions within the 10 to 14 day cycle, spore to spore. So where does that take us? Well, in Australia it takes us to the west of the Great Dividing Range, pretty well anywhere, right across the Indian Ocean, but realistically the Murray-Darling Basin because there's water there and water is an absolute imperative for growing leptospermum in the dry land Australia. No water, no outcome. It's a massive area. Somebody said it was as big as New Zealand. I'm not sure about that, but it's all crisscrossed with the Darling River and the Murrumbidgee and the Murray, and a massive amount of irrigation goes on there. They call it the food bowl, but nobody's really seriously thought of putting a leptospermum industry there, which could work quite well with existing land uses. You know, sort of working with general cropping and all sorts of things they do. They grow vegetables there. Massive amount of agricultural enterprise, and I can't see any reason why you couldn't incorporate a leptospermum industry into that overall picture. Now, this is why we're not going to get myrtle rust. 47 degrees, it'll just cook it. Lowest temperature, -4, though it can get colder in some other parts of the Murray-Darling Basin, but that's just Hay, which is in the middle of it. Rainfall, bugger all. No, very low humidity. Days over 40 degrees, seven of them, usually in January. Days over 35, more. Days over 30, 90. Quarter of the year is over 30 degrees every day. So if myrtle rust spores do find their way into this area, they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to be stopped dead. And I think the entire science community agrees that would happen. You'll never find myrtle rust or its related species or its ability to mutate or any of those things in an area like this. So it turns out that leptospermums like this sort of climate. I've had trials in the Murray-Darling Basin and various places in the region, and I've found that hot weather and very hot dry weather doesn't faze them, nor does very cold weather. We've experienced -6s in areas where leptospermum, even polygallifolium, has been planted. -6 this year, colder at ground level, and they've come out unscathed. It's extraordinary. I was very surprised to see that. Same with Scoparium, no damage at all. So if you've got an irrigated bay, laser level bay, and you've got leptospermum, whether it be in hedgerows or planted as a pure crop, then you look at the television weather forecast and the man says, oh, it's going to be 40 degrees for the next 4 days. You give it a drink, put an inch of water over that irrigation bay, and then it'll evaporate during the day a bit. It'll increase the humidity for that brief window, and the plants will think they're in Noosa. They don't know. It's just humid, it's warm. You know, temperature's been brought down a bit by the humidity, and away you go again. And then you don't water them again until you have the next big heat event. And it's a very, very simple management principle. But you're going to get, with the water, which is an imperative, you're going to get the flow, the nectar flow, and good survival rates and growth rates in your plants. Now, the thing about the Murray-Darling Basin is they grow all sorts of things there, and can you believe it? They grow rice there, but rice is a huge industry up there. Rice is one of the most thirsty crops in the world. If you want to bring leptospermum in and start describing it as a crop in places like this, it's one of the most water efficient plants that they could possibly think of to put there. And I don't think there's be a farmer alive in the Murray-Darling Basin that wouldn't welcome a whole lot of bees coming into the area to pollinate vegetables and all the rest of it. So I think that, you know, I think there's a huge future in this kind of approach, especially, you know, given the latest set of problems that have descended upon us, not just here, but obviously in Australia. And I think that there will probably be more strains of myrtle rust emerging in our lifetime, or yours maybe not mine, but generally speaking. And this, to me, is like a forward strategy for using natural mechanisms to manage a problem. That's what I'm thinking. Needless to say, there's lots of other opportunities in the cereal growing areas of Australia, but the thing that's needed most of all above anything else is water in the root zone at the time of bud formation and flowering. Without that, forget the arid zone, stay on the east coast. Now, where the big topical problem is at the moment with myrtle rust. I've been talking about it for 2 days. I always turn to somebody that's a deep philosopher on a wide range of subjects and to get some guidance. And I always rely on this bloke to help me out with that process. There you go. Remember him? I don't know what the outcome was, but there's a lot that can be done to mitigate the issues. In that sense, Australia is very fortunate, I think. Whether it turns out that way, time will tell. Okay, well, that was the other half of yesterday's presentation. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be more than happy to try and address them. Right. Well, I was interested to see, and I've never seen this at close range before, I was very interested to see the Cowrie Park display out there and the huge difference in foliage. Is that what we're talking about? Foliage between the various provenances that they have and the information they have on each of them. I thought was very impressive. Some of them, I looked at them and I thought immediately, that's not Scoparium, that's Polygallifolium, you know, and no, it's Scoparium. Well, in Australia, I'm beginning to think that the Scoparium that occurs in Victoria evolved into Polygallifolium because that's what it looks like. The further north you go, the more polygall it becomes. There's a big difference between the physical appearance of polygall south of Sydney than north of Sydney. You have plants alongside each other, they don't even look the same. But they're now described as a separate subspecies, although in Australia, Scoparium looks pretty much the same wherever you go. A bit different on the coast of the mountains, but it's very similar. So what the other traits of the species are that vary, I don't know. Work's only just beginning on that, I guess.
Can you generalise and say what the foliage would look like in a harsher, drier climate?
I would say very similar. It would take a while to evolve into something else, but I'd say it would look very similar from what we've seen so far, and you take it away from where it originally came from into a dry environment like the Murray-Darling Basin. It doesn't change. It all looks the same. All looks the same to me, but it looks very different to the New Zealand one. You know, and I mentioned yesterday that the Australian Leptospermum scoparians has evolved really prickly foliage that can just tear your arm to bits if you put it into the bush. Here they're soft. They're really quite nice, like patting a cat. You know, most of them, and that's because I think that it's evolved because dinosaurs were eating them, which evolved into kangaroos, which are, you know, and they were eating, but they don't eat them anymore because they're too prickly and taste terrible. Does that answer the question, or? Yes. I've noticed that just here. But you know why they're going to evolve? It's because the possums will start eating them and they'll evolve their way around that. Sorry. Don't mention the possums.
In New Zealand, Scoparium doesn't self-regenerate down in central Otago when the rainfall's too low. Mm-hmm. Like less than about 400 millimetres of rain is the limit for it here. Does it self-regenerate at less than 400 mils of rainfall in Australia?
Oh, definitely. It's like a lot of Australian species, it responds to fire. That's the main stimulus. So you get a bushfire or a localised fire coming through that tells the plant to open its capsules and disperse its seed. And it'll sit on the ground for a long time until you get a rainfall event, which will keep the soil moist for a defined period of time. It's usually 2 weeks or something like that, and then they'll germinate. We don't get a huge amount of rainfall anywhere really, but compared to here. But I don't think rainfall consistent rainfall is the issue. It's whether or not the soil is moist enough to stimulate germination.
Have you started in Australia having commercial plantations at all yet? And if you do, what sort of spacings and criteria do you use?
That'll vary, but I'll answer the first part first. Yes, there's a huge interest in this, and I maintain the view that as soon as there's enough visual material to go on television, in particular landline, they can get fly around with helicopters, it's going to go ballistic. And there's already corporate interest in establishment of industrial scale plantations of these plants. There'll be 2 or 3 of those. But there's also a lot of people that are beekeepers or want to be beekeepers. The ratio is 50-50 roughly, that will buy, because we sell them online, you know, they'll buy a box or 2 boxes or anything up to 500 online. They'll take them home and plant them because they want to know what it looks like, how it feels, what's going on, you know, before they commit themselves, which I encourage, commit themselves to a bigger project. There's certainly a lot of interest in that. What was the second part, sorry?
Just spacings and...
Okay. The spacings can vary. I know in New Zealand 3x3 is favoured. I like the idea of the English hedgerow and making spacings 5, 6 or 7 metres between the rows and 2 metres within the rows, so you develop a hedgerow effect. So the bees can frolic along each side of the hedgerow out of the wind, jump rows when they need to. Also, it allows you to put in a complementary crop in between them. You might want to grow silage and vegetables. I've got clients that grow free-range turkeys, all sorts of things, providing it is some land use activity that doesn't exceed the height of the leptospermums, because they don't like being shaded at all, trying to get maximum sun exposure. The other reason for the wide spacings is that the sun will come up in the east and it'll hit the whole side of the plant, both in the morning and in the afternoon, and there's a definite correlation between exposure to sun and the quantity and quality of the flowers you're going to get. The most important thing, of course, is water. In Australia, where it's bloody dry most of the time, southern part anyway. I'm around anyway, but I've got a website that covers all this called leptospermum.com.au that talks about spacings and all that kind of thing.
John got called away, and I just want to thank Ted. Very important.